Good evening. My name is Elena Sudakova. I am director of Pushkin House. And thank you so much for coming to this highly anticipated event. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you Ekaterina Schulmann, who currently resides in Berlin, who is a fellow at Robert Bosch Academy there, and she specializes, as you all know, in legislative processes in modern Russia. And tonight, Ekaterina will be in conversation with Grigor Atanesian, who is a journalist at the BBC World Service. So over to you.
Thank you, Lena. Dear Dr. Schulmann, oh, so many. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thanks to the Pushkin House for making this happen. I know your visa took a very long time indeed, and we can talk about...
Everyone seems to be acquainted with my personal troubles, but yes, it was an arduous process.
As a BBC journalist, I have my sources. But we can talk about the issue of visas later. I wanted to suggest the framework for this conversation first. We're supposed to talk about the future, but I think we need to talk about the present a little bit first. I think a lot of people here, before February, they used to think that they knew and understood Russia. And now a lot of us think that they don't know it at all. They see what's happening in Ukraine, Russian army destroying whole cities with bombs and rockets, and occupying peaceful towns, taking countless lives. They also see the majority of Russian population being passive or silent, despite all the efforts of very brave activists who risk prison and torture. And that makes a lot of people very angry or very depressed, or both angry and depressed. You, on the other hand, have been the voice of reason and calm for many people in many places. What I wanted to ask you, how did you feel throughout this last 8 months, and how did your life change?
Thank you, and I must first use this opportunity to thank the organizers for this invitation. I have never yet spoken on a scene like this. It's kind of intimidating. It does make one want to address the audience with a sermon, enumerating their sins maybe. I should also point to your attention the fact that this is St. Paul's Church, the so-called Actors' Church, and this is the place of the first act of Pygmalion, the play, which I think is a particularly apt spot for the demonstration of our skill in using broken English, the most widespread language in the world. So if one doesn't need to be a Professor Higgins to place the accent correctly, but we public speakers have long ceased to trouble ourselves about it. So if you have difficulties in understanding or following whatever is being said, the fault is not yours but mine. Now to your question. The topic of our conversation has been aptly titled with what appears at first sight to be a Shakespearean quotation. Thank you so much. One needs a lot of tea and milk to manage this. So the phrase goes, the fault is not, it is not in our stars, but in ourselves that holds our destiny. This is an extremely popular phrase, and I also had an impression that I recognize it, and I thought, oh yes, it must be from Julius Caesar, and then I decided to, because something seemed strange to me in this phrasing, and then I started searching and found out that it is indeed a very popular turn of phrase, but not exactly correct. That's not quite what Cassius says in his conversation with Brutus. It is indeed in Julius Caesar. But the actual phrase goes like this. The fault is not in the stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. So it's a very apt, and I would think a rather cruelly apt phrase. Cassius is describing the dictatorship of, well, man, he does bestride the world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about, seeking ourselves dishonorable graves. As usual, Shakespeare is rather picturesque than exact. One can't quite grasp why needs one peep to seek a grave finds oneself without any additional effort, but still the intent is clear. Why people allow themselves to be oppressed sometimes by just one person. Who is responsible for this state of affairs? Who is to blame? Whether the stars or destinies or themselves, their personal lack of courage, or maybe some national curse that makes one nation more apt to be enslaved and others to be gifted by some innate instinct of freedom. Such conversations are quite popular, quite widespread. I have a very sad experience of finding more and more of this kind in the public discourse because, of course, ascribing permanent features to ethnic communities or genders or social groups is the purest form of racism that exists. There's a close connection in this kind of ideology in sexism, racism, and my other bête noire, geopolitics. What is the resemblance? Women are like this, and they can be no other. Russians are like this, and they can behave in no other way. Or, in case of geopolitics, maritime nations are prone to commerce and adventurism, and those inhabiting the hinterland are more conservative, and they form hierarchical structures, and they tend to obey authoritarian leaders. All this is, of course, bullshit. Not just because it's insulting to any group or entity in the world, but because it does not take into account the basic feature of humanity, its changeability. We humans are extremely adaptive creatures, for better, for worse. And that, I think, will be the most general and, at the same time, I think the most exact answer to your question. We people are social animals. We need to please our tribe to survive. We need to communicate with our kind to exist. We want to be approved. We want to be liked. We want to be valued. So we generally follow orders. We obey the rules. We do what we are told. Again, it doesn't sound very virtuous, but this is the feature that allows our peaceful communication, that allows us to live together. Our tendency to obey the rules, to want to be good, perverted, it can be used for evil and a kind of a mutually, universally held fear.
Your question, in very simple terms, what would be your answer to that?
These are not simple things, so they can hardly be explained in simple words. But in 2 words, it's learned helplessness, and the process of learning has lasted for decades. It's true that the Ukrainians have risked their lives on Maidan, but before that, they have been living under a comparatively low violent state. They have been inhabiting a comparatively free environment. Before Ukraine became such an all-encompassing problem, I always refused to answer any questions about Ukrainian affairs, saying that I know nothing about it. I only know that it's a completely different political model and a completely different society. And this is a thing not often understood, I used to say back then, because Russians have an illusion that if they have a mother-in-law in Zhytomyr, they know all about Ukraine. But I know, not having I have a couple of relatives there. Now they're all in Austria, but that doesn't matter. But as a political scientist, I know that our ways, both as societies and as political regimes, have diverged in the early 90s and have gone further and further away from each other. You can hardly find 2 less like models. So it's a completely different story. Ukrainians have acquired their habit of political behavior. Russians have acquired theirs.
Do you think this divergence that you mentioned, do you think this war is an attempt to overturn it by the Kremlin?
Is this the question about the reasons of the war?
there will be more of them, and I'm sure there will be more of them from the audience, but you've mentioned the divergence and just wanted to follow up on that.
Again, my opinions may be biased in that I'm an internal policy expert, and I've always considered that external policy is a continuation of internal politics, not the other way around. So my impression was that this decision was taken not so much because of Ukraine as because of Russia. I think it was done to prevent the generational change from affecting political change, in cementing a certain form of political development in such a way, by isolating the country so successfully from outside influences and by, well, crushing any sort of activity, any sort of validity on the part of younger generations, so that the current form stays more or less forever. If we look at this whole thing from this aspect, from this point of view, we may consider this rather a rational act than otherwise. Because again, in studying decision-making, we call somebody, a person or an institution, a rational actor, not because he or they are clever or even successful, but because their actions tend towards a certain goal. A goal can be wrong, it cannot be achieved, and quite another consequences may follow than those initially planned, but still, this is what rationality means in this context. And if you will, for a moment, try to place yourself in the place of a person who feels time running like sand through his fingers, and not just his, but the whole of his generational and social strata that hold certain values, that have a certain worldview, and that have great unity among themselves. Look at the permanent members of Russian Security Council. They're all like brothers. They're all more or less of the same age. They have all more or less the same life experiences. And they have built a certain model. They have formed a certain country. But they cannot help feeling that in another 5 or 7 or 10 years, this whole edifice will start to collapse, because even their own children do not exactly share their values. They feel themselves to be the last defenders of this fortress Russia, and they feel they will be their heirs will be traitors. They cannot trust them. So what to do? How to prevent this inevitable disaster? So when we hear so much about this invasion being a thing which we didn't want to do but had to do, a kind of preemptive action, something we had to start first before an enemy struck, we think it's just some sort of made-up story in order to appear less of an aggressor. But if we imagine, if we try to understand that this enemy is not actually Ukraine or even NATO, you see that Russian authorities appear to be quite indifferent to the accession of new member states into NATO, so it didn't seem to bother them at all, so it's not about NATO. But if it's about tomorrow, if it's about the future, if it's about the time when they will be here no longer, and we are not talking about some one person or two persons dying, but about the erosion of a strata. So again, if you try this rather painful mental exercise, if you try to imagine yourself such a person, you may perhaps better understand the reason for those actions.
It's really interesting that you say that Russia's government actions appear to be irrational, but you say that they may have a sort of perverted logic to them if seen from the right perspective. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I try to explain what rationality means in this regard. And yes, I don't think this logic is perverted. It's the one that we do not share. But again, if you try to put yourself in these people's shoes, you will possibly understand. Why are they constantly saying that we managed quite in time? In a little bit, it would have been too late. I think this is what they actually feel.
Deep anxiety about time running out for them, for their generation.
Well, it's hard to grow old. We all will have to do it, and it's better to prepare beforehand. If we were speaking Russian, I would quote a famous passage from the Dead Souls, right? I think about 95% of the audience are actually Russian speakers, but okay, I won't abuse the privilege of a native language. Just open it and read it for yourself. Nikolai Gogol says that the grave is more merciful than old age. On the grave you will read, "Here lies a man," but nothing will you read on the hard, inhuman features of pitiless old age. So it needs good training to be able to grow old with dignity. The best help that I know is to be a member of a family, to have natural connections to the younger generations so that you don't hate them because they are your own family, so that you look on your own decline and their inevitable growing, not with some chagrin, but with delight. But for this, you need to lead a natural human life. And for this, you need to be a fully developed human creature. This is not the fate of everyone. And there's especially a sort of, as I said, generational and social strata that are not very good at family relations. It's a rather immoral part of society, educated by the aging Soviet power, which was at its most cynical, its most immoral when they had their formative years. And then came the 90s, also not the most ethical time in human history. And then they started believing in the all-powerful might of money. And then they started to think that, for example, a father's duty to his children is just to send monthly sums to their money, to their mother, and that is enough, that it's not a manly thing to engage too much with children and family affairs. Their most intimate relations are between men and men, between comrades or enemies or bosses or competitors. So it's this unpleasant kind of all-male world, not in a good sense. So these are the people who really have very little of what we would term humanity in their nature. Again, I am a political scientist still, despite the tragic occurrences of past months, so I wouldn't ascribe everything to psychology. But I think in terms of values, behavioral practices, ethical norms, it would be good to understand the very specific composition of those people who happen to be running the country.
It is really interesting you mentioned values, because here in the West, in Russia as well, even before the war, we had a lot of people who pretended to know what's going on inside the head of Vladimir Putin, and some said he is trying to restore the Soviet Union, others said he's trying to restore the Russian Empire, others still said it's all about money. Without asking you to get inside, he said, what values, what ideas, what principles do you think drive the Kremlin?
In terms of social science, we may turn to the famous World Values Survey, the largest, the most prominent study of the changing values in various societies. Recently, the results of the 7th wave of World Values Survey were published. Its founder, the famous political scientist, the most quoted political scientist of our time, Ronald Inglehart, had time to see those results and publish one article about it, and then he passed away. So I would strongly advise anyone who is interested in this kind of thing, in order to understand what values actually mean, in order not to be befooled by the common use of this term, or let's talk about traditional values or Christian values or whatever, to actually visit the site of World Values Survey and look for yourselves. World Values Survey strives to engage as many countries as possible. The 7th wave is particularly valuable because more and more Muslim countries are participating. They do not ask, as I said, direct political questions. They rather ask people about what they think about family relations, how children should be educated, whether religion is important in their lives, whether certain practices, behavioral practices are allowable or not allowable, what they feel about abortion or suicide, etc. So this forms a kind of picture which allows the scholars to place certain societies between two axes. the vertical axis, traditional values versus secular rational values, and horizontal axis, values of survival and self-preservation against values of progress and self-expression. Again, I know it's hard to explain in words what is much more understandable in a picture, but still try to imagine the two axes. I do have the slides, but this is not this is not perhaps the most convenient place for showing it. So, coming back to your question, what values drive the Kremlin? This survey, of course, strives to form a representative picture of a certain society. But they also tried to study, to ask those questions to the various social strata, including the upper strata, the so-called elites. So, in case of Russia, the picture that appeared was quite interesting. So, generally, Russian society is quite high up on the vertical axis, so it's a secular society. As I said, it's atomized. The role of religion is really low. A small percentage of people believe in life after death, which is a basic parameter which differentiates a religious from a non-religious person. The divorce rates are high, abortion is tolerated. So again, the resemblance is with the Chinese rather. At the same time, Russian society sticks to values of survival and self-preservation rather than self-expression. This is directly connected to the level of economic development. So when there's, simply speaking, not enough food to go around, then people tend to rather worry about survival. You will understand that the events of the 20s, it seems to be a merry decade, judging by the way it began, will of course drive Russians still closer to the values of survival. The more developed countries, the richer countries, the freer societies, they tend to move towards values of self-expression and progress. By the way, among the post-Soviet Slavic republics, according to the seventh wave as compared with the sixth, the previous, the one that moved furthest towards values of self-expression and progress was Belarus. They have experienced a societal transformation since, I suspect, 2016, 2017, which no one actually mentioned. But coming back to the Kremlin and its values, if we compare the so-called elite sample with the general sample, in terms of values, we will see
So they have like two separate metrics?
No. They have this one dot which represents a society. But if you look in more detail into their materials, they have also been trying to form separate pictures of various social stratas. So, if we look at the results for those higher up as compared to the general societal set of values, what we see, again, unlike in other societies, where the elites, because they live more protected, sheltered, privileged lives, are less apt to worry about survival, and they are generally kind of more progressive than society in general, simply for the reason that they can afford it. In Russia, it's the other way around. Our elites are a parody of the worst features of our people. So this is the group, the social group that sticks closest to survival values. Their levels of trust are lower than those of the society in general. They also tend to be more traditionally minded. They more often describe themselves as religious. They have less tolerance for minorities. Again, not as compared to Sweden or to United States, but as compared to their own compatriots. So, it appears that the famous phrase of Pushkin that government is the only European in the country has for some time, and for quite some time, before we noticed it, turned exactly the opposite. The government, the generalized government, is about the worst part of society that can be found anywhere. This is quite a paradoxical thing. One of our most respected academic political scientists, Vladimir Gelman, calls it a paradox of bad governance. Russia is weird. Well, Russia is weird for many reasons, but Russia is weird in a sense that it has a much lower quality of administration than would be natural for a country with comparable levels of urbanization, literacy, and even GDP per capita. So there's something slightly unusual about the way the country is governed.
So on the level of the values, to have an illustration, you take your, average Dядя Vova from your yard who abuses his wife, doesn't go to work, drinks all day, every day, watches TV.
So this is your idea of an average
No,
Russian,
not an
right?
average. The
Let
worst.
us not have this thing here, please. Not again, not in my presence.
No, not an average. You said the worst of the society. So imagine some of the worst people you know, and this would be people in the government.
Many of the worst people I know, I met during my experience on state service. And in places like this. So what's the question actually?
No, I think you answered that question already about the values. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about values and Russian state and society. Timothy Snyder, American historian, recently wrote that Russia has a cult around their leader. It has a cult of the dead, which of course he means the cult of the Second World War in its particular Putinist version. He said Russia has a myth of imperial greatness and it wages a war to restore that greatness. All this, says Timothy Snyder, makes Russia a fascist state. Do you agree?
Yes, I have read this article the moment it appeared, of course. It made quite a splash. So I think nine reasons why Russia is fascist, right?
More or less, yes.
So fascism is an extremely unfortunate term. It is so loaded with subjectivity, to put it mildly, that it can hardly be used in its technical sense. It can hardly be used as a political science term rather than a term of opprobrium. But fascist or totalitarian political models do possess certain features, some of which are common to other dictatorships or to autocracies, but some are quite unique, and these unique features are what makes fascism and not just some other form of bad governance. First of all, there's no monopoly on political violence. You don't need to be Hitler to get into a conflict with a neighbor over a piece of land. And you don't need to be Stalin to repress and kill your people. It is true that totalitarian models, being equipped with an all-encompassing ideology, manage mass murders better than anyone else. But again, what are those features that distinguish totalitarianism from authoritarian political regimes? Paradoxically, these are the features that are kind of common to democracies and to totalitarian countries. Both stand on engagement. Both need their people to participate. But democratic participation is, of course, voluntary and based on diversity. There's a number of offers of political parties, leaders, discourses, etc. But democracies need their people to take part, to engage. This is the kind of petroleum they run upon. Totalitarian models also need their people to engage and to participate, but their participation, their involvement is, of course, followed and actually guaranteed by violence, and there's no diversity of offers. There's just one party, there's just one idea, there's just one leader. On the opposite, autocracies stand on disengagement, on demobilization, on depolitization of the people. They don't really need any of those citizens around, either for voting like in a democracy or for working them into, I don't know, wood or oil or convertible currency. That's what totalitarian models do. That's why, for example, they always tend to close the borders. They don't want their people to run away. But autocracies They absolutely encourage immigration. And we see it even now in circumstances in which almost every country in the world would close its borders. We see that Russian officials absolutely encourage by various ways, direct or indirect, they encourage people to leave. So, totalitarian model needs an all-encompassing ideology which is the main feature of its educational system. Every other goal or aim of education is secondary to ideological indoctrination. Totalitarian models do not just have the cult of the leader. They have a certain picture of past, present, and future, which is presented to the people as the only truth. Again, why do they kill so many people? Because they have the bright ideal before them, because they have what is now called the picture of the future, which is so beautiful that no sacrifice is too big for the achievement of this bright and shining ideal. And what could be done with those who stand as an obstacle between us and this eternal bliss? The answer is self-evident. So, this is the other feature of totalitarian political regime. It's not only, and it's not specifically about the personality cult. And by the way, in Russia, we don't have it. We don't have it even on the level of Kazakhstan, well, in its previous political form. There are no portraits in public places. No one ever dreams of renaming a university in the name of the president. It's just, I don't know, it doesn't come into anyone's head that much. No matter what the degree of sycophancy within the power circles, it's not transmitted to the people. It is just not necessary because, why? Not because the leader is so modest. Stalin used to boast of his modesty as well, but because there is no need to engage the people, to bother them too much, even with the name and the face of the national leader. This is why Russian political model is in such throes. It's not an agonist, but it's in a dire strait right now. It's trying to do what is possible for a democracy. Democracy can mobilize. Why not? It's possible for a totalitarian dictatorship. It's always mobilized. It's always in a state of war. That's what Soviet Union was before it started to soften a little bit after the Second World War. But this in-between political system, political way of running things, of making and implementing decisions, it's based on exactly the opposite principle. That's why I think Russia is not fascist. For the last 6-7 months, it's been trying to kind of assume certain fascist features, like to invent an ideology, like to indoctrinate school children, like to try to form ad hoc some sort of new cultural elite, new panel of influencers, of leaders of public opinion who will be sharing certain values. But because no one knows what these values exactly are, and because you can't invent an ideology out of your head on the spot, and especially in such stressful moment as this, these fascicizing attempts have not exactly been successful. What we see instead, and this may be also well, not also, this may be an equally dangerous and sad line of development. What we see are certain things that rather tend to the failed state of affairs. We see the dissolving of state monopoly on legitimate violence. We see more and more independent actors who practice this violence. We see the dissolution of that vertical of power which was our pride and our boast, and in which so much effort was invested during the last 20 years. Now we see a certain type of perverse federalism taking place. So they say the generals tend to prepare for the battles of last wars. We all tend to be afraid of things that we know. We Russians are always afraid of a strong and cruel state emerging. We are not so much afraid of the state collapse. There seems to be no Hitler in view, and you can't suddenly transform yourself into a Hitler, a brand new, young and active fascist leader. This very cult of death which you mentioned, is the argument rather of the opposite. Fascism and communism in its younger days was a very much progressive, modernist, youthful ideology. It was attractive. It was attractive to intellectuals. It was attractive to the young. Hitler was the idol, first and foremost, of the younger generation. He killed them off for their pains, but he was popular with them, not with the military pensioners like the current happenings and the current leadership is most popular with. So again, let me repeat my initial thesis. Sadly, no political system, no political model has a monopoly on crime, violence, and general historic misfortune. So you don't have to be Hitler to destroy your country.
I was listening to your description of what totalitarian fascist regime looks like, and a lot of it seems like just a description, like lines from the articles I've read and stories I've read from the occupied Ukraine, now occupied by Russia. A lot of it, they're fake referenda which have been held at gunpoint, where people who survived bombings and invasion are forced to vote. Then this is what you've described. All the men taken in Donetsk and Luhansk region, specifically taken to the front, to the army.
Oh yeah, speaking of genocide, these are very unfortunate places, these bloodlands, as the unpleasant term is. I think we have successfully killed off all their male population.
You've mentioned genocide. Do you think Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine?
Again, this is one of those terms that it's dangerous to bandy around. Genocide is an intentional extermination of a certain group, most often an ethnic group. To engage in genocide, you need some sort of plan for doing this. It's not just violence, intertribal violence, although, for example, we call those things which occurred in Rwanda, the violence in Rwanda, also a genocide.
Or Bosnia, Srebrenica?
Srebrenica wars comes close to the actual definition of the term, because there was a plan, and it was directed towards specific religious and or ethnic group. What is happening in the territories, in those territories of Ukraine where Russian forces stand, it resembles much more what was happening in Chechnya, and also what was happening more recently in Syria. Speaking of surprises, yes, we didn't pay enough attention to the violence that happens elsewhere. As somebody said, peace is when they're shooting somewhere else. Evil violence is not containable. It cannot be limited to certain districts where bad things happen. If bad things happen somewhere, it will come back home. If birds of evil, they will come home to roost. So again, I wouldn't be sure about genocide. I would very much want to see a proper international court deciding on this question rather than myself answering it.
Well, historian wrote an article called Genocide of Minor Differences, where he says that Putin's articles about Ukraine, his constant denial of Ukraine's culture, history, and statehood constitute an intent, and then this war constitute an execution, and thus he says this is a genocide. That's his opinion.
Again, this is an interesting point. Hitler didn't want to re-educate Jews into being proper Aryans. He didn't try to explain to them that they were just Germans who have mistaken notions. But here we have this singular illusion. And again, it's so natural. Just imagine those people. Imagine their life experiences. They have had no education whatsoever.
Right.
Yes, these are about the most benighted social group in human history. Some of it is not even their fault. They have been young in unfortunate times. The social class to which they belong does not value knowledge or science or education. They have been badly taught or not taught at all. They think that their personal experience constitutes universal knowledge. You may have read this long article, this long read in Washington Post, The Battle for Kiev, in which they try to describe what happened immediately before the war. You will possibly remember how they transcribed the conversation between Russian Minister of Defense and I don't remember which of the highest American authorities, who the American interlocutor said, Ukrainians will fight back. And Shoigu said, my mother is from Ukraine, I know them.
Yeah, I know them better than you, yeah.
That's it. Again, these people do not know what knowledge is, what science is, what books are for. Never had lack of education had such tragic consequences. They think of themselves as such great cynics, and they fall for every heresy under the sun. Every fraud will win their hearts. Now it looks innocent in comparison, but do you remember this guy Patrick and his, I don't know, healing water? What they call their religion is some low form of shamanism. Again, my excuses to actual shamans. It would have been better to all of us if they followed any religion, if they were Christians, or at least I'm often thinking when I hear them talk, what would happen to their poor minds if any one of them would be forced to read the gospel? I'm afraid their heads would explode because it's contrary to every principle they cherish. So again, excuse my wonderings. What were you actually asking me?
Oh, we were talking about genocide, I think.
Oh, yeah, about genocide. Nice, pleasant topic. Let's come back to it for a change. So, about genocide and about the denial of Ukrainian identity. Of course, the official idea is that so many Ukrainians have been indoctrinated with this horrible heresy of their being Ukrainians that some of them need to be killed off. But the rest need to be re-educated, and then they will see the error of their ways and become Russians again, as they actually are, but they have been deluded by the West, etc. That's the idea. I'm not saying that this is not a good excuse for genocide, but I think you will agree that this is a slightly different kind of basis, ideological foundation, than ideological foundations for the Holocaust or for the civil war in Rwanda or for the Serbian atrocities. It's one thing to think that a certain group of people has no right to exist. They are so bad, they need to be killed off. They are a threat. They are different, they are the other, nothing to be done with them except killing them. And it's another thing that you want to actually bring this erring brother into fold back into the family by, of course, killing all his other relatives, but that's, again, that's another point.
Do you think there was a change sometimes, few months into this war? Because we saw that at some point, especially when the Russian military started really losing or having setbacks in Ukraine, there started to be like a constant, just senseless bombing and shelling of Ukrainian cities, like Kharkiv, for example, which is not explained by any military rationale. It just seems out of spite, and that sort of seems to be...
Military people do not act out of spite. They try to pretend they have followed orders. When they experience, as you put it, setbacks, they need to report with something else. The natural thing to come up with is, we have spent so much missiles. Look what a great job we are doing. If we can't advance, we can at least do something. You will read enough, I think, very, at least, they read to me like very believable pieces of analysis as to how decision-making and decision implementation is organized in the Russian army, how centralized that is, and how full of lies. If we would try to formulate in shortest words what happened to us as a society, we have been too much used to lying. We'll need to do something about it in future. But in terms of the army operations, this is what it comes to. You can't succeed, you can't deliver, you need to report. You are afraid to report the truth. What you need is just to make yourself appear more or less decent looking, and what is really happening on the ground is not your problem. You say there's no military rationale for this. Of course there is not. Before the war, when police atrocities happened, I used to explain that the worst things done in the country are done for the sake of отчетность, for the sake of reporting. This is why people torture and kill other people, just to report, just for the sake of statistics, just to deliver something on paper. And this is truly horrible. Not for the sadistic pleasure, not for the sake of achieving some some very important goal, a goal that is so important that you can ignore human suffering, but just because we need this protocol filled and signed.
I think you just gave the shortest summary of Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil, which is also a book about genocide.
Again, what are you trying to drive me to?
No, it just, we needed to address this topic. I think I'm gonna last question, and then I will put this over to the audience who have questions. My last one
Well, maybe not. Let's not anticipate. You know, the speaker always hopes that there will be no questions. People will just, oh, thank you so much, we'll go home now.
No, I have one last before that. One more. What is, in your view, the biggest misconception or mistake the West is making about Russia?
There's no such thing as the West. Let's put it first. I do not like those generalizations at all. They are not scientific and they're not rational, and they lead to mistakes. And you will perceive that in Russian official discourse, there's so much talk about the unified West. And by the way, for example, Japan is also West in this parameters.
Okay, let's say British and American political scientists.
The Anglo-Saxons. The evil Anglo-Saxons. I so much love this term. So Anglo-Saxons are worse than general Europeans. So I wonder whether Angles are worse or Saxons. What about Danes and Normans? Were they pretty good? So the Anglo-Saxons, and again, who am I to point to, you guys don't understand the mysterious Russian soul? No, I don't like this position at all. I've been in Germany now for some months. I've been, of course, in close communication with academic and expert circles, because what else am I to do? No one else will be in communication with me. And I find a high level of expertise. I find many excellent analysts and scholars. And what makes me, at the same time, sad and grateful, I still find so many people who actually like the country. Before that, I used to know that people who study Russia are usually Russophiles. There was something actually quite engaging about the nation, about history, and about the culture. So people used to be drawn to it, and then they start studying it, and they are drawn to it more and more. So if we had political leadership, by means of soft power alone, we could find ourselves a much more advantageous position in the world. But, again, to come back to your excellent question, I would not like to place myself in a position of somebody pointing to mistakes. But what some people and institutions do not get is this specific kind of, at the same time, isolation of the power structure from society, but also their connectivity. What I mean is this. It's easy to form an idea of a strong autocratic state that is all-powerful, ruthless, cruel, violent, and delivers the results because of this. It's harder to understand, and Russians understand it instinctively. It's hard to understand this mixture of strength and weakness, of transparency and haziness, of truth and lies, that forms the texture of a corrupt autocracy. It's harder to understand, again, this mixture of make-believe, of propaganda, of lip service, and of the actual thing. Our system can do a lot. It has its great points of effectivity. It can do logistics, especially on short-term logistics. It can organize events brilliantly, Olympics, international forums, football championships. We do it excellent, in a really excellent manner. Russians appear to be quite good at providing services, but that's not thanks to the state, but rather while it was looking another way. We have, coming back to the state, an extremely efficient financial economic bloc, which is doing wonders in very trying circumstances, actually saving, I would say saving the country, but at the same time saving its political leadership, so it's a two-edged sword. But, for example, to try to explain what I mean, during the pandemic, Russia was not able to do what many of the liberal and seemingly weak democracies of Europe were able to do. That is to impose a strict quarantine. Our government tried to introduce a bill implementing QR codes as part of Russian legislation. Was there a mass protest? No, there was not. It was actually quarantine. You could do many things. You could go to a restaurant, but you couldn't protest. But there was some kind of diffused discontent. And they pulled it off, in sense of took it back, or rather stalled the progress of this bill in the State Duma. And this is the government that can pass any legislation in a day. Yes, of course it can. It can do some things, but not others. Why? You can kill a person, but you can't prevent him or her from going to a restaurant. In other countries, it's the other way around. Every nation, every political nation has its own abilities and disabilities. And this, again, is very hard to explain to an outsider because it's not linear. You see, it's not direct. It's not like if you are a tyrant, you are all-powerful. You are extremely powerful in many things in which, for example, a democracy is unable to do, to pull off certain things. But then again, you have your weak points in unexpected places. It is generally supposed that Russian power is indifferent to public opinion because it can quell any protest. But it is also extremely attentive to public opinion. They're crazy about polling. They have their own secret polls done by FSO, the federal, not the Federal Security Service, which is FSB, but FSO.
Basically bodyguards.
The bodyguard service, yes. And again, it's so hard to explain, but I will not even go into those details. There was another structure before, it was called FUNKCII, the Federal Agency of Governmental Information and Connection. And then one part of it went to FSB, another went to FSO, and the part that went to the bodyguard service was the one that conducted certain sociological surveys. And now they have those secret surveys. When they were still FUNKCII, and I was an extremely young municipal servant in my native Tula, we used to be shown those secret results. We had elections those days, so they mainly did election polling. We were shown it and told that this is not the kind of thing they print in the newspapers, this is the real stuff. And then elections came next day, and it was nothing like the actual results. Again, we had elections, it was in the 90s. I'm very old. I'm as old as an ant. I feel like a fangorn sometimes. I remember the starry night without fear before the Dark Lord came from the furthest west. So I do hope that the quality of their sociological work has grown during those years that intervened between me and the Tula city administration. But this is to say that every week, I think almost every day, new polls and surveys are being taken in order to understand what people will tolerate and what they will not. The natural question is, if they will not tolerate it, what will they do? The usual question that outsiders ask is about protest. Where are protests? Whether they are mass protests, whether this specific protest will spread into an all-national protest campaign. But that's not the thing Russian political nation does. It uses the so-called tools of the weak: evasion, hypocrisy, imitation, sabotage. And judging by the excellent results of the present mobilization, you will see that it's quite an effective toolbox in its way.
Thank you, Ekaterina, and we will open this up for the audience. You will be approached by a person with a microphone, and I will also be taking questions from our online stream. So please do send your comments, and I will read some of them, the smartest ones. I think you was the first question in the first row.
One. Hi, my name is Tanya Livingston, and my question is, so you often say that it's very important to be an active political citizen, to be into politics, to read about politics, to actually know something about what's happening in your country. But for a person who grew up in Russia, that's still a very hard thing to wrap your head around, as you think nothing will change, and you also think that it's all very, very difficult, and some special people have to do it. You don't have to do it. So my first question is, how to change that? How to change that mindset? And the second question is, if you were to become a literary critic or someone else, not a political scientist, would you still be into politics? Would you still follow it? Thank you.
Thank you. Both very good questions. To the first of your questions, there's a very easy answer. The government is doing all this for us. It's doing an enforced mass politicization. Much good may it do to them. You may remember there was this popular joke in the best Russian vein of black humor. Do you know what concentration camp are they taking us to? I don't know, I'm not into politics. So, the new version is, do you know what front line are they taking us to? I don't know, I never much cared about political stuff. So now people suddenly started to care. It's all very good to sneer at those that have suddenly realized that something is happening. Another punchline in Russian internet is this, ой, а что случилось? Oh, and what has happened? But again, let us not indulge in this, it's too easy. Yes, people have been depoliticized for 30 years. And it paid off, because it was actually good for you to concentrate on your own affairs and those of your family, to invest in yourself, as the saying is. I'm also a little sad about the progress of psychological knowledge, which generally is beneficial, but in a sense that it tells people that their problems mainly result from something within themselves, that you need to turn to yourself and then to consider your attitudes, to, I don't know, learn certain exercises that will help you get less nervous, etc., etc. Care for yourself. It's a very good thing, again, a very good thing to do, but it kind of creates this individualized, atomized individual that is very much concerned with his or her psychic equilibrium. Again, a good thing in itself, but in a situation where your problems do not come from the fact that you have wrong attitudes or that you had some issue with your parents, but because you have a tyrannical government that is going to kill you, then, you know, breathing deeply wouldn't help you much. And even trying to find a center of gravity within yourself also wouldn't serve your problem. I would wish that rather than teaching people this kind of stuff, we could have taught them common actions, mutual help and understanding, horizontal connections. But you cannot teach these things, you cannot preach these things. You can't say to people, you should trust each other more. Why are you so distrustful? We have such low levels of trust, it's a shame, let's change all this. The only way for these levels of trust to go up is for people to have experience of successful collective action. First collective, then successful. And this is, of course, a trap. You will not have experience of successful collective action if you don't trust your neighbors. And you won't trust your neighbors because you have no reason to. You have never experienced anything good from them. But now, people realize that politics touch them very closely, more than skin deep, I would say. And then they are forced into communions with their kind. They need to share information. They need to, I don't know, unite somehow. They need to understand what's going on, and you can't understand it on your own. Even to run away, you need to run away successfully. You need to be part of a certain network of help, or at least of information sharing. So, back in 2017, when there was this renovation campaign in Moscow, I was saying that this is done exactly for the sake of forming a real civil society in the city. People have sensed a threat, and they have united in order to counter this threat. And indeed, this renovation was a precursor for the success of the opposition on municipal elections in the same 2017. So this mobilization is a much more large-scale event to happen to many people at once. So this is about your first question. And the second, what was the second? If I were a literary critic, what would I criticize then? Would I still be into politics? You know, I was very much into politics, maybe because my formative years happened to be during the perestroika. I went to school in 1985. So it was all the rage with the grown-ups. They were discussing political developments. They were reading the magazines and newspapers. They were listening to TV and radio news. And of course, I wanted to be with the grown-ups too. So I understood that this is the thing to be interested in. And then it was interesting. It was a very, very, I would say, engaging time to live in. So what I think Durkheim calls the fresh contact, the new experience of a growing person which determines his or her ideas of how society works, of how you communicate with other people. This happens during the so-called fresh contact. Fresh contact is, for example, when you leave your family to go to school, when you leave school to get higher education, when you go to work for the first time, when you have your first romantic relationship. This is the fresh contact. And this, again, forms more or less forever your idea of how these things are done. So, while at the beginning of my, I don't know how to call it, it's not of course a social media career, but when I first started writing on social media, it was on LiveJournal, I didn't write so much about politics. It was the middle of 2000s, the golden era. Internet was free and almost free of people. The first elves wandered the starlit plains of Beleriand singing to themselves. There was almost no one around. And again, sorry for those Tolkienistic quotations. I don't know why I come up with them so often. Maybe that's because the Rings of Power was so bad that I needed to somehow change this impression by reading the original again. Again, sorry if I'm hurting anybody's feeling, or again, sorry if I'm talking about things no one cares about in this audience except myself. So, I didn't write about politics. I wrote more about, yes, art, and mostly, of course, about fiction and non-fiction. Back then, meddling in political discussions was not a proper thing to do. It happened somewhere else. Again, I'm now speaking strictly about social media. People there were using bad language. They were evidently uneducated. They were quarreling among themselves. That's not where we, the proper people, went to. So we had our own communities, our own societies where we discussed higher and better things. But still, coming back to formative years and fresh contacts, well, at that time, when I was so much into talking about Nabokov on LiveJournal, I was actually working in the State Duma, and I liked it a lot. It was a very nice place to be in, so much happening around, the third convocation, which I think still is the pinnacle of post-Soviet parliamentarism. I'm not going to go into details of this, don't be afraid, but still, I think that me, being myself, would have been rather interested in political things, whatever happened.
Thank you very much, and we
try to keep the next answer short. I swear.
I think the audience really wants your answer to be long, and we have a question from the second row as well. I'm sorry, there is no way I can possibly say who raised their hand when, so it will be all really chaotic.
The important thing to do, I'm sorry, is to have no disparity between the front rows and the rows
Absolutely
through
no,
the
there
back.
would be full diversity of the rows.
Yes, there must be equality, or at least there must be an equal chance. Not that I think that asking a question to myself is such a privilege, but just for fairness sake.
Okay, over to the...
Good evening, my name is Konstantin Akinsha, and I have two comments and one question to make it easier, so it will not take too long time to answer it. My first comment, the question of genocide. Of course, it's a very complicated question, but when we are talking about the Third Reich, and genocidal practices are not limited by the Jews. And if you remember German practices in protectorate Böhmen and Morin, when Germans practiced Aryanization of Czech people, prohibiting Czech language and selecting those Czech people who, according to German opinion, could be Aryanized. And of course, maybe many people here remember the story of Lidice, the place, population of which was basically totally killed after assassination attempt on the Heydrich. And the children of Lidice, all children of Lidice, all children who were in this village, were taken and sent to Germany and were adopted. And there was the famous movement after the war of the searching for the children of Lidice, which is absolutely repeating the Russian experience in the which recently happened in Mariupol, because children of Mariupol were sent and adopted to Russian families, which is obviously genocidal practice. Destruction, I'm not saying, I'm understanding, it's a very complicated question. It could be decided by international court and not but you and me. Destruction of Ukrainian books in the libraries, which we have documented cases from basically Poltava region to the west, where Russians are coming with this, confiscating books. In the best case, they are putting them in some kind of hidden storages. In the worst case, they are burning them, which, of course, provoking the idea of culture side or suspicion in culture side. So this story is not finished. I am understanding that it's early to talk about genocide, but to reject this possibility is too late. So we are somewhere in limbo between two. My question is, you are stating that Putin and his government are not supported by young people. Do you have, let's say, hard sociological data which could prove that your words are right? It's my question. And my last comment, I hardly could imagine historically.
Sorry, I'm sorry, but I think
comment.
we need to keep this to questions.
Yeah. Short comment. I could not imagine, let's say, German sociologist being hosted in the United States around 1940, telling that he is very happy that his American colleagues are not only very knowledgeable, but Germanophilic. Thank you.
You think it's impossible? Maybe not. Okay. Coming back to your question about the opinions of the younger generation, it's not just that I have data to support this wild thesis, but every data that is available to anyone points only one way. Age is the single most important parameter determining opinions on the war, support for the leadership, anti-West stance. The younger the strata, the less we see of those things. It's one of the paradoxes of this war is that it's so much the war of 55 plus. And they are the only people, maybe that's not a coincidence, who will not be touched by this mobilization campaign. Actually, war should be a thing for the young, right? A social lift, a career opportunity, a glorious adventure. Let the boy win his spurs. All people are supposed to be conservative. They would want to preserve what they have built over the decades of their active life. But currently, we have the exactly opposite picture. So usually, the polling data is divided according to the age stratas 18 to 24, 24 to 40, 40 to 55, and 55 plus. So actually, on political issues, there's sometimes less difference between 40 and 20 than between 55 plus or 60 and everybody else. That brings me back to my point about a special generation. I know it sounds like trying to lay the blame on some specific group, choosing it as a scapegoat and saying that the rest of society is different. Of course, generational values is a tricky thing to study. People change over time. There's much discussion in social sciences as whether there's such a thing as generational values at all. But still it strikes one as really surprising that on almost every political and social issue on earth, there is such a huge difference between the younger and the elder, and those above 55 differ so much, not just from their grandchildren, which would be a more or less natural thing to assume, but from their children as well. We have those three relatively numerous age stratas now active on the social scene. We could call them grandparents, children, and grandchildren, 60, 40, and 20. Of course, this is all very approximately. Some 60 years old have young children, etc. You will understand that we are dealing with broad generalities. But if we do, and we cannot avoid generalizing if we study something, then we see that parents and grandchildren have much more in common than the grandparents have with both of them. And this especially concerns opinions concerning how is it?
Thank you. First of all, Ekaterina, thank you so much for coming. I think you are an inspiration for a lot of people, and thank you for being here. So my question is, I think that is relevant for a lot of people here. So what is the most useful thing that we, as, let's say, people who hope for a better future for Russia, can do from abroad to help Russia become better and for the war to end? Thank you.
Again, I'm put into a painful position of giving advice. I haven't been able to answer this question to my satisfaction about myself, so I'm not sure if I'm qualified to advising other people what to do. What I know is that, for example, there are many civic initiatives that need volunteers and that could use distance help. For example, those initiatives that coordinate helping those arrested during protests. They need somebody on the phone, and they very often need people on the phone around the clock. So being in a different time zone may be actually very helpful. If you can dedicate some hours in a week to being on the phone volunteer, it would greatly help. Then, again, now I think the term refugees can be much more aptly applied to Russians than previously. Previously, we were talking about relocation, about evacuation, or about just people seeking some better place to live. But now it's an exodus. The sheer scope of this misfortune horrifies me. It's incomparable to what was happening in March or April. This has given some basis for moral judgments, but we have had enough of moral judgments. My point is, many people are running away without preparation, without resources, without funds. If you can help, you will help greatly. I see how these nets of help are being formed out of thin air, because everyone has some family member who needs to be quickly pulled out of the country as fast as possible before the borders are closed. Personally, I do not think, well, personally I suspect that the borders may not be closed, but I will not give anyone advice based on this opinion because the risks are too high. What if I'm mistaken? Well, yes, this type of political model very rarely tries to keep its citizens to themselves. But what if tomorrow it changes? I will not have other people's life on my hands, so I will eschew expressing my opinion in this regard. You can also try to keep contacts with your Russian friends, relations, and acquaintances, even if they have opinions that drive you crazy. You may put any communication on hold. You do not have an obligation to talk to people who whom you don't want to talk to, but do not cut the connection. Just put it on hold, let it be there. For those months I've been saying that the time may come then you will need it. Now the time is coming. Then your Russian friends and relations and connections and acquaintances will have such problems to deal with that will put every ideological consideration on the second ground. This may sound cynical, but then if you have managed to keep this thinnest of lines still unsevered, still complete, now may be time to kind of turn it on. If you are able to do it, if you can take upon yourself the rather unpleasant labor of resuming this communication, this may also help greatly. These are the first things that occur to me. Do not give up on the country. I'm afraid I must say that the Russian Federation, as we have known and studied it, is living maybe its last months or maybe weeks. For better, for worse, it will be a different political model. But the nation can't all run away, or it can't all just disappear or die off. Nations die very rarely, even those nations whom there was an attempt to kill off wholesale. So something will remain, and that something may possibly need all our help in a future that is not so distant. So if you can preserve a certain degree of tolerance towards this social and cultural entity, let's put it this way, this is a very brave thing to do, to try to keep in your mind, and this may turn very useful, again, in a not so distant future.
Thank you, Ekaterina, and I will be also asking questions from our live stream, as promised. And the first question, very first one we had, was, I thought, very good indeed. The question is Russia capable of developing outside the imperial project, and what needs to be done today to achieve this? What needs to be done to achieve this? Once again, is Russia capable, can Russia be not be an empire, basically?
It's an interesting question. The alternative to the empire, even an imaginable empire, is more or less a nation state or a national state. So to put it bluntly, are Russians able to form a national political entity? They haven't tried for quite a long time. And this is not the only way to be a country. You can be a republic. You can even be a parliamentary republic. And this kind of steers you in between those two Scylla and Charybdis alternatives, the empire that constantly needs to enlarge and the nation state which needs to somehow get rid of its already acquired national parts. So I personally suspect that what we are now seeing is really the last stage of disintegration of this Soviet imperial project. Ethnic nationalism is not popular in Russia, the country's best kept secrets. Russians don't care about Russian nationalism. They care more about territorial achievements, acquirements, which may not be a good thing to hear, but they don't care so much about... Well, we have enough down-to-earth chauvinism to go around, but this actually is more connected to just a low level of culture than to some nationalistic idea. Russians like to boast of the many bloods that they have mixed up in their composition. It's indeed a subject of boast. If you have ever talked to a Russian or to yourself, you know this kind of discourse. Oh, I have relatives everywhere. So we are not concentrated on ethnic purity, not at all. On the other hand, Russians are much less used to, for example, racial diversity than people who live in European capitals. We are accustomed to going everywhere, hearing the same Russian language. We have no dialects. Well, no important dialects to speak of. Even in England, a relatively small country, linguistic differences are much more pronounced in every sense of the word than differences in Russian language between Kaliningrad and Vladivostok. This is the gift, maybe the questionable gift of Soviet power. It used to relocate people in masses. It imposed a unified system of school education. There was a monopolized informational field. Everyone was watching the same movies and listening to the same songs, etc. So in this respect, we are a more or less homogeneous, again, political nation, not an ethnic nation. So I think no one is an imperialist, again, by nature. It's not in human nature to want to inhabit an empire rather than any other political form. There was the great empire of Habsburgs, the Austro-Vengrian one, Austro-Hungarian. It was quite a success for more than 1,000 years, and then it somehow dissolved. Britain used to be an empire. Oh, I remember those glorious days. And a very nice empire it made until the time then it didn't, and then it went on living. Again, not as a national nation in this sense of the word. So again, these things are very much prone to liable to change. We should not ascribe unchangeable modes, unchangeable tropes of political behavior to any group of people.
There was a second part to that question, how to achieve this, how to make whatever comes next after this not an imperial state, and how to avoid imperial violence again.
Again, the government is doing half of the job for us. Whoever will survive will, I think, have quite an allergy to imperial projects. Actually, before propaganda started to vamp up on this whole Russian world thing, we were seeing quite pronounced tendencies towards a kind of Russian isolationism. An idea that we're spending too much money on foreign countries, we're helping everybody, we don't have enough for ourselves, the government should concentrate on internal issues. This kind of stuff that European countries have been hearing a lot of, especially during election periods. America first, etc. So if we had an opportunity for free political choice, this isolationistic party, an imaginary party, would be able to achieve quite a success. Again, if we had open political competition, open electoral competition, because Russians do have this idea that everyone is using them, that they should actually concentrate on themselves. And this chimes very well with these values of personal success, personal consumption, benefit to oneself and one's family, rather than some higher ideals, bad ideals or good ideals, no matter, that would encourage a person to sacrifice. It's funny, again, it's nothing funny about it, but it's ironic how the idea that Russians need nothing for themselves, that they just can't live a day without making personal sacrifices, is being imposed by the state propaganda on a people that is as individualistic as you would ever want to see. It runs so counter to the actual state of the nation, to the actual state of collective mind, that this possibly answers for the fact that this propaganda has such little success in determining people's actual behavior rather than the answers they give to the pollsters.
Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone, my name is Alena and I come from a very small republic in Russia which is called Republic of Kalmykia, and Ekaterina, it's lovely to meet you back to London again, and I have two short questions. How exactly can we call, if not genocide, that in the village out of 490 people, 90 are subjects for mobilization? And second question is, how likely that Kazakhstan will send people as subjects for mobilization back to Russia? That's a very dear question, like practical questions to me, as we created association and helping to flee hundreds of people now because they sent like all our men to die.
Sorry, can I follow up on that? So you're talking about a village in Kalmykia where...
No, I'm talking the whole republic, the national minorities, genocide towards national minorities in Russia.
Yeah, it's the same in Buryatia.
Tiva, Buryatia,
Yeah.
the same.
I know. Speaking about genocide, now I hear the term used, the term that has been bandied about so much by propaganda, being used inside the country in a very different meaning. National republics are starting to, well, be very naturally unhappy about the role they are forced to play. Again, it's not to blame anyone, but at the beginning of the war, when it looked more of a success and less of a disaster, as it started looking further on, there were some sort of misplaced pride on the part of those боевые буряты, yeah? Those warlike Buryats who were in the first lines of those entering Ukraine, in what seemed then a kind of triumphal procession. But then it appeared that the losses are distributed very unevenly, and an idea crept into people's minds that the government, the federal center, is sparing. Actually, they're not sparing Russians. They don't care about Russians. It's the same with villages in Kemerovo region, whether they're going to a village with 180 male population and taking out 50. So only the elderly and the women are left, like after the Second World War. They try to spare inhabitants of big cities because they make noises, because they know their rights, because there's media attention, and because they're afraid of urban protests. They try, and not unsuccessfully, to prey on the most undefended, on the most powerless, on the less educated. But at the same time, this is a very smart policy. Take the poorest, they can defend themselves. But it has one drawback. It is awakening this very national consciousness, which they've been trying to suppress, or rather to merge into this all Russia idea for the last 20 years. This vertical of power, which was our pride, is now, I think, kind of at a great risk of falling apart. It appears they've been feeding separatist tendencies in the national republics. They are more pronounced in the Northern Caucasus. The most active protests are in Dagestan. But I remember how the Kalmyks protested when they sent the Russian mayor to their capital, to Elista. And they've been quite successful in driving the guy away. By the way, he came from DNR, from the Donetsk Republic. I don't know if he's still on the ground. Anyone knows? Not that I'm. Yeah, they have invented another post for him there in Elista because they couldn't show that they gave in, but in fact they did give in. So in those poorer regions, there's also more solidarity because people have no other structures to fall upon except non-nuclear family and the local community. So it's as stupid as it gets to follow this policy course, which again, it seems so smart until the time that it doesn't. And the second question about Kazakhstan. There was, as I understand, a misunderstanding in interpreting and quoting the declarations of certain Kazakhstan officials. What they said was, if there would have been an individual request according to the criminal investigation, like in the Interpol system, they will consider it, but they will not send back, and they have not said anything to this. In this respect, they are not sending back people who flee Russia to escape conscription. So what one needs to do in order to get anyone back, you need to open a criminal case, and so far failing to show up after you've been sent повестка is an administrative offense, not a criminal. So you need a criminal case opened, you need it prosecuted, you need to send the request, and then it will be considered. Is our system able to do this kind of thing now that they are busy running after numbers, not after individuals? The time used in doing all this paperwork can be much more profitably employed in catching 100 other people who haven't had time to run to a Kazakhstan border. They may try to make a case or two for terrorizing the others, but with the tendencies that I see in Kazakhstan relations with Russia, I do not think that the government will be very eager, very quick to answer those requests. I'm so happy I invested some time in studying Kazakhstan before it was mainstream. I used to call it my second favorite country. Now it kind of shares the first place in my heart with my poor motherland. I'm going there the first week of October, very much looking forward to being in Kazakhstan again. I was there last time in 2021. So again, that was not the question that you asked, but still, can never avoid the temptation of talking about Kazakhstan. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, can we do the middle? Somewhere there, people are desperately raising their hands. Denise, I think, yeah, you'll nail it. Whichever one. Sorry, I cannot possibly tell who was first.
Okay, thanks a lot for coming to London this time again. It's been a pleasure to see you. And my question is not for speculation, but rather to get better understanding of the current regime in its current state and their ability to use the tactical weapon and readiness to accept the consequences.
Again, an honest answer to your question will be I don't know. I'm not a military expert in any sense of the word, and I'm not going to turn myself into one, although we all have gained some unwanted military knowledge during those last months. But still, I'm not an expert. I don't understand the difference between tactical and other types of nuclear weapons. I don't understand what the consequences will be. I do not understand whether Russia actually possesses something that is able to fly and explode, or to explode first and fly afterwards. So I will only add one point of which I am capable of judging. It's a very unfortunate thing for any speechwriter or for any public speaker to be using the phrases like, it's not bluff. Honestly, I'm not lying. What does it show? It shows that you know that your audience think you are lying and you have no other argument but just telling them, no, I'm not. I know you think I'm a liar, but actually I'm not a liar. Why? Anything to support this thesis? No, no. So it's, again, it may be just an unfortunate turn of the phrase, but I think it's rather expressive of the state of the mind of the person who pronounces it. I will not draw any practical conclusions from this observation, but it's at least an observation that I can offer to your attention.
Ekaterina, but there is, if I may, a political dimension to a question of nuclear use by Russian government. So I understand it's not one man's decision. It needs to be implemented by other people. And the question that a lot of people are asking me and other people who they think understand something about the system, I don't, but maybe you do. Is there nobody to stop him? If he makes that decision, will there be people to stop him?
Again, how can we answer this question? Do we really know what it entails to make such an order and to have it followed? This thing about 3 people in a chain of command, maybe it's an urban legend. Maybe now some nuclear expert is laughing in his or her sleeve. Maybe it's altogether different. Maybe there's no such thing as this nuclear suitcase with a red button. Maybe it's as realistic as, I don't know, Mr. Evil from Austin Powers movies. Why? How can we make judgments on such a grave issue without the knowledge? As about anyone being able to stop an autocrat. Of course, these people, my favorite group of people, the permanent members of Security Council, have undergone a severe process of negative selection during the years. They were not very bright or energetic people to start with, and during the last 20 years they have met with no obstacles, they have faced no opposition, they have had some sort of internal squabbling between themselves, but nothing else. Actually, anyone who has had experience of dealing with people who have occupied, for example, high managerial position for years may have noticed that they have something weirdly childish in their nature. They inhabit a kind of Platonic universe where the word immediately becomes action. It's like a 2 years old who thinks that what he says immediately comes true. So he asks for an apple, and he is given an apple. He says he is cold, and he is immediately made warm. The crisis of 2 years, psychologists tell us, exactly consists in a person having to realize that he is not omnipotent. But when you climb higher and higher up, every next step you take severs you from reality that can strike back, to make myself clear. And so you enter the second childhood. To add, the 2 COVID years have not been beneficial to a mental health of anyone. Maybe the worst thing COVID has done was exactly, again, to use a non-scientific term, driving crazy quite a number of people who had better have stayed comparatively sane. So I wouldn't put that many hopes on anyone stopping anyone else based on the idea that these people want to live. You see, these people for years have not faced the consequences of their decisions. They have this very innate idea that no harm can come to them because they're so rich, they're so powerful, they're so protected. So misfortune is what happens to somebody else. Again, it's so childish. Death is what happens to another. It can never happen to me. Again, sorry, no more optimistic version in this case.
Oh, good. There is no hope whatsoever. Let's give this to the first row, Denise. If you you have somebody.
One thing, the speaker would like to know how many more questions will we be able
I think
to take?
let's take this to and see what's going.
To take 2 questions, and that's all.
Probably
Right?
yes. Does that
That's
sound
something
good?
to look for.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
the questions are all excellent questions, but we've been doing it now for 2 hours
Yes.
almost, so maybe the audience as well is a little bit
People
tired
are running
of this
away
whole
as we
discourse.
speak,
Okay, 2 questions. I can take it upon myself to at least try.
Thank you very much.
Добрый вечер, Ekaterina Mikhailovna. It's very good to see you. Yeah, it works. Thank you. First of all, personally, I'm very impressed with your excellent knowledge of English language.
Thank you. Like when people who have started by reading, I mispronounce about every second word. But as I said, I have ceased to worry about it for quite some time.
You're very good. Thank you very much. And so I have 2 questions. One of them is about me. Another one is about you.
One is about?
Me, myself.
Okay.
So I have friends in Russia, and they stay in Russia, and they're ready to go for a war if they were asked to. So how can I explain to them that this is not our war, so we have nothing to defend in Ukraine, nobody attacked us, and they won't be heroes to anyone? And the second question, I have another friend who asked me to ask you, who does Ekaterina Schulmann watch or read when she needs to read someone like Ekaterina Schulmann?
Yeah, I've seen this question on Twitter a lot. Let's start with the second question, it's easier. I am a person who can't absorb information by listening to it. I can hardly understand lectures when spoken. And I do not watch videos, almost never, very, very seldom. I'm a reading person. So whenever I want some distraction from, this excellent joke, I'm going to watch a horror movie in the evening to get comfortable after news. So some comfort watching, like The Walking Dead or something of this kind. I read paper books, which I would strongly advise anyone else who is at all like me to do. I remember the horrible first days and nights in the end of February when sleep was well-nigh impossible. You slept by installments. First 3 hours, break 3 hours, like a baby. Again, another joke, yes, how are you? I slept like a baby. Oh, really? Every hour I woke up and cried. So then it became 15 minutes, Then it got worse. And I discovered that the first thing you want to do when you open your eyes is to, of course, watch the news. But you can't do that because you won't go back to sleep again, even for the next 15 minutes. But if you read a paper book, then you can manage another sleep stretch. During those days, we were expecting hourly to read and to see the news of Kiev taken, I don't know, Zelensky shot or detained, etc. When this thing did not happen, again, inhuman as it may sound, things became slightly easier. But then again, I'm a person who is comforted by reading long texts. It's not everybody who has the same tastes. Speaking of videos, until recently, I have discovered an excellent, in my opinion, teacher of English literature on YouTube. Her name is Octavia Cox. I came across her videos quite by chance, and she is explaining, she does what she calls deep reading or slow reading. She's explaining certain things about mostly Jane Austen novels. So I've been listening to her. She has that British accent that holds a charm to every Russian's heart. You know, we can never withstand the attraction of a British accent, and it's about Jane Austen. So I've been listening to it for quite some time. The last video said that she's having she's been offered some other position, and now she stopped making videos. Very, very sad. Maybe they did it on purpose to silence her up about Jane Austen. So that's about your second question. About your friends who are so eager to be war heroes, you just wait till they get a повестка, and then you'll immediately perceive them turning into peaceniks in a moment. If they have not a chance to get conscripted, then they won't get a chance to actually participate in any war activities. Ask them next time what they have been doing for the last 8 years. Why are they not volunteering already? Why are they spending time talking to you? How about defending the people of Donbass? So turning, you know, conversation to practicalities may help a lot. Everyone should at least try to practice what they preach. So maybe this may be a good starting point for a conversation, or a successful end to a conversation, which will also make your life easier.
Thank you very much. And I think the last question will be from the first row, because we are committed to the equality amongst the rows.
Not equality, at least diversity.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is quite a direct one, because you've spoken about coups, oh, actually maybe not, but protests. But essentially my question is, how does Russia free itself of Putin then?
Short and sweet. Free yourself from dictatorship in 12 easy steps. Number one. Yeah, again, there's a popular Russian expression in these cases. Read the answer in our new book, Know-how. So that is also not true. Ответ читайте в нашей новой книге «Никак». Russia will be freed from the current state of its political, well, way of things, to put it generally, in some way or the other. Again, maybe sooner than we think. Overthrowing a dictator in the way it's written in children's books happens actually very rarely. Personalist autocracies tend to much more often be defeated or ended by internal coups, elite struggles, than by popular uprising. Actually, if we do good political science, we would not oppose the one to the other, because these are all parts of one process of regime disintegration. To have a mass protest, you need organizations. It does not happen just of itself. When all people or in one accord suddenly get into their heads to get out on the streets and protest. You need structures, you need information channels, you need leaders, you need organizations. And autocracies crush organizations. They specifically hunt political leaders and public speakers. They discourage any, however innocent, sort of mutual activity. They've been doing it, in case of Russia, for decades. Instilling this questionable wisdom into the minds of the people, like everyone for itself, you are important for yourself. The thing is to care about your family. It all sounds very well, again, until the moment that it doesn't. But when regimes started to weaken, either because they have exhausted their resource base, or because they have committed some political blunder, or because the generational change has come, then both elites start to look elsewhere for a future, and the people, the masses, start to be less afraid of protesting and to be less afraid of self-organizing, because it seems a better option than to die alone, frankly speaking. Actually, Vladimir Lenin's formula still holds true. Those higher up cannot govern in the old way. What does it mean? The orders are not followed. Decisions are not implemented. It's not about, as we usually picture it to ourselves, about some general standing up and saying, I won't be shooting at my people. They usually make decisions of this kind when they think, why should I be investing in this specific dictator who is most likely to fall? I don't want to be held responsible, so I better kind of stay aside and say, I'm sick at this specific day. So it's not a humanistic decision, it's a very self-interested decision. But elites start to realize that their orders are not followed, the decisions, as I said, are not implemented. So верхи не могут, those high up cannot govern in the old way. Those lower down do not want to live in the old way. Why? Because they have stopped being satisfied with this sort of societal contract. You do not meddle in our affairs, we do not meddle in your affairs. This nice agreement is evidently broken. It was also sort of disintegrating lately, but now it has been severed with violence. And the third part of Lenin's formula, those who are older will remember it, the political activity of masses is rising. Thanks to the internet, thanks to YouTube, but rather not thanks to them, but thanks to the suddenly realized need to understand what's going on, now that it concerns you so closely. Do we have all the three parameters in place? And this, again, is a formula for the revolutionary situation. By the way, speaking of Lenin, I wouldn't recommend him as a philosopher, but for his very specific practical job, which was achieving power by violence and keeping it by violence, the old man knew his tricks. So it's quite useful to read something of what he wrote, especially, he was a publicist rather than a philosopher. He did short pieces as well. So, again, brush the dust from your Lenin full edition, and you may find some useful things, especially about the need to take the telegram, the telegraph first, and the bridges afterwards. And about Facebook and YouTube being not just collective educators and propagandists, but collective organizers as well. This is also very aptly noticed. So, do we have all the three ingredients to make hellfire with? Not yet, but partly yes. This, I think, is rather a good finale to our very variegated discussion. Thank you so much for the profundity of your questions and for your patience and the generosity of your attention.
I just wanted to thank you for a brilliant conversation, for such a deep analysis, for your knowledge, for your sense of humor, your wit, and for giving us some hope. And there couldn't have been a better spokesperson for the Pushkin House Book Prize, our 10th anniversary book prize, which actually happens tomorrow. And so watch out for the winner, who will be announced tomorrow at 10 p.m. Thank you, Ekaterina, and thank you, Grigor.
Thank you.